Before watching this story, it's important to understand who the woman we will be talking about next was. Sister Margaret Ann Pahl had an ordinary, well-ordered life, much like most people who devote themselves to service. A 71-year-old nun who had worked at Mercy Hospital in Toledo, Ohio, for nearly 2 decades. A coordinator of the liturgical life of the chapel, a person known and respected by everyone in the institution. She had her plans, her established routine, and her duties, which she performed with the thoroughness that was characteristic of her. And so, on the morning of April 26, 1980, on Holy Saturday, the eve of Easter, she came to the sacristy to prepare everything for the festive service, as she had done for many years in a row. And no one knew that this ordinary morning would be her last. A few hours later, her body would be found on the floor of the sacristy with 31 stab wounds, and the investigation of this case would stretch over 26 years. But let's take everything in order. Let's start with Sister Margaret herself. She devoted her entire life to the church, and by the age of 71, she had decades of service behind her. She came to Mercy Hospital as a relatively young woman, and gradually became the person without whom it was difficult to imagine the work of the chapel. From the very beginning, she was described as a person of principle who knew exactly how everything should be organized and was not shy about saying so. Later, it was this quality of hers that would become a source of certain tension with colleagues. But then, she just did her job, made sure the vestments were in place, that the services were conducted according to all the rules, and that everything corresponded to the traditions she considered unshakable. Colleagues recalled that she was demanding but fair, that her word carried weight, and that if she considered something wrong, she would definitely report it. She kept records, noted observations, and some of these records would later be preserved and become part of the case files. She lived at the hospital. Her circle of friends consisted mainly of colleagues and parishioners. She had no personal enemies, and there seemed to be no serious conflicts. The ordinary life of a person who found her calling and followed it to the end. Around the same time, Sister Margaret had already been coordinating the life of the chapel for many years. A new chaplain appeared, Father Gerald Robinson, a 40-year-old priest whom colleagues described as a calm, even reserved person who rarely raised his voice and tried to avoid open conflict. He was responsible for the spiritual care of patients and staff, held services, and visited the sick. Just a job, nothing special. But tension quickly arose between him and Sister Margaret, and it was no secret to those around them. The disagreements concerned the approach to the services. Sister Margaret adhered to strict traditions, believing everything should be as it was established, while Robinson leaned towards simplifying rituals, a more modern approach. At first glance, you must agree, a trifle. One might think, different views on how to conduct a service. But it is important to understand that in the closed world of a church community, such trifles tend to accumulate, and over time, something much more serious grows out of them. Sister Margaret repeatedly expressed dissatisfaction with the chaplain's work, felt he did not take his duties seriously enough, and even recorded her observations in writing. She did not trust him, and several colleagues would later confirm this in their testimony. And so these two, who had such different views on the same work, worked side by side in the same chapel, crossed paths every day and interacted one way or another every day. And no one could have thought how it would all end. So, April 26th, 1980, Holy Saturday, Mercy Hospital was preparing for Easter services. The staff were going about their usual business, and the chapel had been open since early morning. Sister Margaret, as always on such days, came to the sacristy early to check everything, prepare everything, make sure the vestments were in place, and that everything was ready for the holiday. The sacristy is a small room next to the altar, about 20 square meters, with one entrance from the altar side and a window to the inner courtyard. Access there was restricted. Only 4 people had keys: Sister Margaret herself, Father Robinson, and 2 other employees. An outsider could not just get in there, which is important to understand for what follows. And so, around 8 in the morning, one of the hospital employees entered the sacristy and found Sister Margaret there. The elderly nun lay on the floor in an unnatural position, and it was immediately clear that something was wrong. The woman called for help. Doctors came running, but it was already too late. Sister Margaret was not breathing. There was no pulse, and injuries were found on her body. Not 1 or 2, but many. Later, experts would count 31. For now, you must agree, nothing foreshadowed such an outcome. An ordinary morning, ordinary preparations for a holiday, and suddenly, this. It immediately became clear that this did not look like an accident or a robbery because the belongings were in place. Valuables were untouched. The door was not broken, and the windows were intact. Whoever did this entered freely. They had a key or were let in, and this immediately narrowed the circle of suspects to a very small number of people. Security arrived within 3 minutes. The entrance was cordoned off, and the doctor on duty stated the obvious. The first police patrol appeared at about 8:02, and by 9, an investigative team was already working on the scene. The sacristy was sealed. Staff were isolated for questioning, and the Easter service was cancelled. The first such occurrence in the institution's history. From the beginning, the investigation established the time interval with fairly high accuracy, between 7 and 7:30 in the morning, only 30 minutes. Experts based this on several factors: the temperature in the room, the condition of the tracks, and the testimony of those who had seen Sister Margaret the day before. And here is what is important to understand. This was the ideal time for someone who wanted to remain unnoticed. The hospital was just waking up at that hour. The night shift was finishing work, and the day shift had not yet started. A transitional period when staff is at a minimum. The chapel was located in a separate wing, where random people rarely looked in, especially early, on a weekend morning. The security guard made his rounds at 6:45. Passed by the chapel, the door was closed, the lights were off, nothing suspicious. The next round was not until 8:30, almost 2 hours without supervision. A cleaner appeared in the wing around 7:15, worked at the far end of the corridor, and heard nothing. No screams, no sounds of a struggle. And this, you must agree, is strange. 31 wounds and total silence. Either the attack was lightning fast, or Sister Margaret simply did not have time to call for help. As the investigation would later establish, both likely occurred. The medical examiner began his examination at 10 o'clock, and what he discovered did not fit into any standard categories he had encountered before. 31 wounds, and these were not chaotic blows or blind rage where a person just hits anywhere. The injuries were located in groups, as if according to some system. 9 wounds on the left side of the chest formed a clear geometric figure, several more on the neck, and the rest on the face and hands. The expert took photographs and diagrams, and when he overlaid the images, a pattern emerged that made everyone stop. The 9 wounds on the chest formed a cross, an inverted one. In the Catholic tradition, this symbol is associated with desecration, with an anti-religious message, with something deeply hostile to the very essence of faith. And here, it became clear that whoever did this was not just attacking an elderly woman. He was leaving a message. He knew the symbolism. He understood what he was doing. And he wanted it to be seen. Forensics processed the sacristy literally, centimeter by centimeter. Characteristic stains were found on the altar cloth, indicating contact with a damaged surface. The cloth lay over Sister Margaret's body, and it was clearly placed there intentionally. Moreover, a distinct imprint appeared on the fabric, the outline of some object whose shape resembled a small blade with characteristic handle geometry. The weapon itself was never found. The attacker either took it with him or hid it so securely that it could not be found. But this imprint on the fabric would later play a key role, although no one knew it then. The version of a ritualistic nature of the crime became the main one, and it's clear why. The inverted cross on the nun's chest, the altar covering used for a purpose other than its intended one, the location of the body in a sacred place, all this pointed to a symbolic act. And the circle of suspects, if you think about it, narrowed very much. The locks on the sacristy doors were intact. The windows were not broken, and there were no signs of entry from the outside. Whoever committed the attack entered with their own key or was let in voluntarily, and the keys, as we remember, were held by only 4 people. And among those 4, one stood out in particular, a person with a theological education who perfectly understood the symbolism of the inverted cross, a person who was in conflict with Sister Margaret and whom she openly distrusted, a person who was in the hospital that morning and had free access to the sacristy, Father Gerald Robinson. Police conducted the first interrogation. Robinson answered calmly, did not deny the disagreements with Sister Margaret, but called them professional, an ordinary matter. He was released. Suspicions remained, but there were no formal grounds for detention. And then, no one knew that this man would live in freedom for another 24 years before justice reached him. Detectives continued to focus on Robinson. Formally, he was a witness, but in fact, he remained the main suspect. The third interrogation took place 2 days after the discovery of the body. The conversation lasted several hours, and investigators reconstructed literally every minute of that morning. Robinson answered measuredly, and his version sounded simple, perhaps even too simple. According to him, the morning of Holy Saturday began as usual. He woke up around 6, stayed in his room until 7:30, read, prayed, prepared for the service, then went down to the dining room, had breakfast, and learned about what happened from colleagues around 8. The version looked plausible, but there was a problem. It was impossible to verify. Robinson's room was in the residential wing, separate entrance, no guest logs. No one saw him between 6 and 7:30, an hour and a half without witnesses. And it was during this interval that the attack occurred. Investigators pushed, asking him to repeat his testimony. And here is what's interesting. The details matched word for word. Yet, usually, people get confused about small things, change their phrasing, remember something new, add details. Robinson, however, reproduced his story mechanically, like a memorized text, as if he had rehearsed it in advance. Colleagues described his reaction to the news about Sister Margaret, and these descriptions would later enter the case files. He showed no surprise, asked no questions, expressed no grief. He simply nodded and continued breakfast. One of the nurses remembered his words. "It is the will of God." This sounded cold, detached. Not at all the way a priest who had just lost a colleague under such circumstances should respond. In the days after the discovery, Robinson did not change his routine, appeared at work on time, performed his duties, and never spoke about Sister Margaret on his own initiative. When others raised the topic, he answered in monosyllables, "It is the will of God. We must accept. We need to move on." These phrases were repeated like prepared answers. And here is what else is important. On the same day, a few hours after the body was found, Robinson conducted a memorial service for Sister Margaret. He said that the community needed comfort, that Easter should not be overshadowed. His voice sounded steady, no trembling, no pauses. He read the prayers as if nothing had happened. One parishioner described his gaze as empty. Another noted that he avoided looking at Sister Margaret's relatives. A third remembered a strange detail. After the service, Robinson smiled at someone in the crowd, fleetingly, almost imperceptibly, but she saw it and could not forget. For a priest who had just lost a colleague, the reaction seemed unnatural. But an absence of emotion is still not proof, and the detectives understood this perfectly. A week later, investigators obtained a search warrant, a room at the hospital, and an apartment in the city. Detectives were looking for a weapon, something sharp, something suitable in size for the wounds found on the body. The search of the room took 3 hours. Standard priest surroundings, books, vestments, religious items, nothing special. And one object that immediately attracted attention. On the desk lay a letter opener, a decorative item in the shape of a medieval sword, a brass handle with engraving, a narrow steel blade about 12 centimeters long. The detectives looked at each other because the size matched the experts' preliminary estimates, and the shape of the handle resembled that very imprint on the altar cloth. The coincidence seemed too exact to be accidental. Robinson watched the search calmly. When asked about the knife, he shrugged and said it was a gift from a parishioner, used for opening envelopes. Nothing special. The knife was seized and sent for forensic examination. The blade was clean, no visible traces. The object had clearly been thoroughly washed. But experts measured the parameters of the blade, width, thickness, sharpening angle, and compared them with the data on the injuries on the body. The width of the blade matched the width of the wounds, 1 to 1. This was the first concrete link between Robinson and the attack. But the link was indirect, insufficient for a charge, because such knives were mass-produced and anyone could own a similar item. The prosecutor's office studied the materials and refused to file charges. Insufficient grounds. The knife was returned to Robinson. This decision would later be called a mistake. But at that moment, It seemed the only one possible. Meanwhile, the inverted cross on Sister Margaret's chest gave rise to rumors that spread very quickly. Satanists, occultists, a secret cult that performed a ritual sacrifice in a holy place. Newspapers picked up this version with enthusiasm. Headlines screamed about devil worshippers. The public demanded action, and the police were under pressure. They had to investigate this version, even if it led away from the main suspect. Detectives compiled a list of known occult groups in the region. The result was modest. Several teenage groups interested in symbolism, a couple of eccentric loners, not a single organized structure. Toledo in 1980 was a conservative city. Satanism existed there, only in horror stories. The investigation lost 6 weeks on this false lead. 6 weeks that could have been spent on pressuring Robinson, looking for witnesses, or a more thorough analysis of the evidence. And the key fact remained unchanged. The locks on the sacristy doors were intact. The windows were not broken, and whoever committed the attack entered with their own key. Satanists from the street simply could not get into a locked room. Logic pointed to the inner circle, to a person who was trusted. Everything returned to the starting point. And here, pressure came from an unexpected quarter. The leadership of the Catholic Diocese of Toledo expressed concern. Officially, they demanded justice for Sister Margaret. Unofficially, they were concerned about something else. Suspicions against a priest cast a shadow on the entire church. The bishop met with the prosecutor. The conversation remained confidential, but after it, the tone of the investigation changed. Fewer interrogations of Robinson, fewer public statements. Detectives felt this change. Some would later call it pressure. Others would say it was just a coincidence. The truth remained somewhere in between. The prosecutor's office summarized the results. 3 months of active investigation, dozens of interrogations, hundreds of hours of expert work. The result was disappointing. The main suspect was identified, but there was no evidence for an arrest. Every argument of the prosecution had a counter-argument from the defense. The investigation was suspended until new evidence appeared. The folder went to the archive. Photographs, interrogation reports, expert findings. And 2 key pieces of evidence: the altar cloth with that same imprint and the knife, which was never returned to Robinson due to some bureaucratic delay. A lucky accident that would later play a decisive role. Robinson learned about the suspension a few days later. His reaction remained unknown. He gave no comments to the press, just continued his service. A year later, he received a new assignment, another parish, another city, far from Mercy Hospital. His career was not affected. He served for another 23 years. All this time, the evidence waited patiently in the dusty boxes of the archive. Technology evolved. Science moved forward. But no one knew that then. 23 years. That's how much time had passed since that Easter morning. The world had changed, and changed very much. DNA analysis, which in 1980 was in an experimental stage, had become a standard procedure. Computer modeling allowed events to be reconstructed with an accuracy that could previously only be dreamed of. Bloodstain analysis methods had turned into a full-fledged science with a clear methodology. A new unit appeared in the Toledo Police, the Cold Case Unit. It was created in 2003, and a group of experienced detectives was assigned to review old cases using modern methods. Sister Margaret's case was one of the first on the list. Detective Steve Forrester led the review. He brought up the archival boxes from storage, dusty cardboard boxes with faded labels, and began studying the materials anew. Photographs, reports, expert conclusions, and two key pieces of evidence that had been kept all these years in ideal conditions: the altar cloth in a sealed bag and the letter opener in a separate container. Forrester inspected the items and made sure the chain of custody was not broken, and the documentation was impeccable. For 23 years, no one had touched the evidence. They were perfectly preserved. Father Robinson's name surfaced immediately, and Forrester began a check. Robinson was still serving as a priest in Toledo, but his name now appeared in other materials. Several reports of improper behavior, complaints from parishioners, accusations of abuse filed with the Church Commission. None had gone to court, but a disturbing pattern was emerging. A wave of revelations swept through the Catholic Church in the early 2000s. Victims were finding their voices, and Robinson fell into the focus of a church investigation. He was suspended from service in 2004. Forrester saw the connection. A man with a history of abuse. A man suspected of a violent crime. A man who escaped justice due to the technical limitations of his era. Now those limitations were gone. Forrester presented a plan to management, a case review, a new forensic examination of the tablecloth and knife, bloodstain analysis using methodologies developed in the 90s, and computer contour overlay. Management approved the request, and the case was officially reopened in early 2004. After nearly a quarter of a century, justice was given a second chance. Forrester turned to Paulette Sutton, a bloodstain pattern analysis expert with 20 years of experience. With hundreds of cases across the country, her methodology was recognized by courts as scientifically sound. Bloodstain pattern analysis is a science that allows for the reconstruction of events based on traces. In 1980, this discipline was in its infancy. By 2004, it had turned into a powerful tool. Sutton received the tablecloth and knife and began with a detailed study of the stain. Using magnification equipment and special lighting, the contour emerged much more clearly than in the old photographs. The shape of the blade, the widening at the base, and something else that experts in the 80s simply hadn't noticed. The print showed small irregularities, characteristic protrusions along the edge of the contour. Sutton made precise measurements, every millimeter, every notch. Then she conducted an experiment. She took Robinson's knife, applied a special substance to the blade, and made a series of prints on fabric identical to the altar cloth. Different pressure, different angles, different conditions, dozens of samples. Then she compared them with the original stain. The result exceeded all expectations. The match turned out to be not just close, it was unique. The notches on the blade exactly matched the irregularities of the contour, millimeter for millimeter. But the main discovery lay ahead. The knife handle had a decorative medallion, a small protrusion with an engraving. On the original stain, there was a characteristic mark, a round imprint at the base of the contour. Sutton overlaid the handle's profile onto this mark. The match was perfect. The diameter of the medallion, its position relative to the blade. Even small details of the engraving showed through on the fabric. The probability of such a coincidence tended towards zero. Sutton prepared a 40-page report. Scientific justification, methodology, photographs, overlay diagrams, and statistical analysis. Her conclusion was unequivocal. The imprint on the altar cloth could only have been left by this specific knife, not a similar knife, not a knife of the same model. Specifically, by this object, seized from Father Robinson's room in 1980. For 24 years, the evidence had kept it secret. Now, it spoke. The prosecutor's office received what had been missing before: a direct link between Robinson and the scene of the attack. His knife had left a mark on the fabric covering Sister Margaret's body. Explaining this as accidental contact was impossible. Forrester called the prosecutor. It was time to prepare an arrest warrant. But first, Forrester decided to interrogate Robinson one more time. In April 2004, he personally called him and invited him for a talk to clarify details regarding the old case. Robinson was already 64 years old. For 24 years, he had lived peacefully. Suspicions had long remained in the past. He agreed to come without a lawyer. Forrester counted on exactly that: the element of surprise, a false sense of security. The interrogation began gently. General questions. How long have you served? Do you remember Mercy Hospital? Did you know Sister Margaret? Robinson answered confidently, clearly not taking the situation seriously. Another formality, another detective digging through a dead case. He had seen such people before. They came and went, and nothing changed. After an hour, the conversation moved to the details of that morning. Where were you between 7 and 8? Robinson repeated the old version: his room, prayer, breakfast. But the phrasing had changed. There were small discrepancies with his 1980 testimony. Back then, he said he was reading. Now he mentioned he slept until 7. Then, he said he went down to the dining hall at 7:30. Now he named a time closer to 8. Forrester recorded every word. 24 years had erased the details from memory, and a lie requires an impeccable memory. In Robinson's case, it failed. The detective went on the offensive. He pulled out photographs, shots of the knife, shots of the tablecloth, shots of the stain with its characteristic contour. Robinson fell silent for the first time. A pause, lasting several seconds. Then the familiar phrase, a letter opener, a gift, never used for any other purpose. The same words as 24 years ago. But the tone had changed. Tension appeared. Forrester showed the contour overlay diagram. Robinson asked for a lawyer. His last words during that interrogation sounded almost defiant. You won't prove anything. You couldn't then. You can't now. Forrester did not argue. He knew what Robinson did not. Science had moved forward. The evidence had already spoken. On April 23, 2004, detectives drove up to Robinson's house. An arrest warrant, a charge of murder. Robinson opened the door himself, without surprise or panic, as if he had been waiting for this visit. Forrester read him his rights. Robinson listened in silence and held out his hands for the handcuffs. Not a word of protest, not an attempt at an explanation. For 24 years, he had lived with this. Perhaps part of him was tired of hiding. To the question of his occupation, he answered, a priest of the Catholic Church. These words were spoken at the police station. They were repeated in the news, and they shocked thousands of people. A servant of the church accused of murdering a nun. The news spread instantly. Television channels interrupted broadcasts with emergency reports. By evening, all of Toledo knew. The public was divided. Some demanded justice. Others could not believe it. Because Robinson had served in their parishes, baptized their grandchildren, and performed funerals for their parents. The Catholic diocese issued a statement in restrained terms. "We are shocked by the accusations. We pray for everyone involved. We are cooperating with the investigation." Not a word in defense of Robinson, not a word of condemnation. The church distanced itself from its priest. Times had changed, and in 2004, the institution could no longer protect the accused the way it had in 1980. Robinson was left alone. The trial began in April 2006, 26 years after that Easter morning. The Lucas County courtroom was packed to capacity. Journalists, relatives, church representatives, and the simply curious. Robinson sat at the defense table, 68 years old, grey-haired, calm, wearing a formal suit instead of a cassock. He looked like an ordinary retiree. The prosecution built its case on scientific evidence. The main witness was Paulette Sutton. She spent 3 hours before the jury explaining the analysis methodology, showing overlay diagrams, photographs of the notches on the blade, and their imprints on the fabric. Sutton spoke confidently and accessibly, turning complex science into a clear story. Her conclusion was unequivocal. Only this knife could have left such a mark, no other. The defense attacked on all fronts. The age of the evidence, 26 years of storage. Possible contamination of samples. The unreliability of witness memory. They invited their own experts, questioned Sutton's methodology, and called the analysis subjective. They pressed on the absence of DNA because no biological traces were found on the blade. The prosecutor countered. The chain of custody for the evidence was flawless. The documentation was complete, and there had not been a single protocol violation over all those years. Courts across the country recognize bloodstain pattern analysis as admissible evidence. Sutton had worked on hundreds of cases, and her expertise had withstood appeals. The absence of DNA was explainable. The knife had been thoroughly washed, and 1980 technology simply did not allow for the detection of microtraces. This did not negate the physical imprint on the fabric. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 12 people weighed the facts. On May 11, 2006, they returned with a verdict. Guilty. Robinson listened without visible reaction. His face remained stone cold. Sister Margaret's relatives wept. Journalists scribbled their reports. A quarter-century of waiting ended with a single word. The judge announced the sentence a few weeks later. 15 years to life. Robinson was led away in handcuffs. He never spoke a word of remorse, neither during the trial nor after the sentencing. The lawyers filed an appeal and fought for several more years, but without success. Higher courts upheld the verdict. Robinson remained behind bars. Robinson was sent to the Richland Correctional Institution, a maximum security facility. The former priest became inmate number A5109561. He was assigned a single cell. The administration feared for his safety because, in the prison hierarchy, people with his profile occupy the lowest rung. He spent his first years in isolation, gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, and filed no petitions for pardon. He simply existed, day after day. His health deteriorated, and by 2014, when he turned 74, prison doctors diagnosed a serious illness. He was transferred to a prison hospice. He spent his final months under medical supervision. There were almost no visitors. The church had long since renounced him, and his relatives did not maintain contact. He died alone, just as Sister Margaret had spent her final minutes in that sacristy 34 years earlier. Robinson passed away in July 2014. Not a single word of remorse throughout all the years of imprisonment. Not a single confession. Not a single attempt to explain what happened. He took the truth with him. Why he did it. What exactly happened that morning. What motives drove him. The answers to these questions were never heard. Perhaps he believed himself innocent to the end. Perhaps he simply did not want to give satisfaction to those who convicted him. His silence became his final act of control. Sister Margaret's family received what they had been waiting 26 years for. Official recognition, a guilty verdict, and the punishment of the perpetrator. Her niece made a statement after the verdict, speaking of the ability to finally move forward and that Aunt Margaret was not forgotten. Justice arrived late, but it arrived. The case of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl went down in the history of criminology. It proved that time does not protect the guilty, that evidence patiently waits for its hour, and that science is capable of revealing the truth decades later. The Toledo Police Cold Case Unit continues its work. Other unsolved cases are waiting their turn. Technology is developing. Methods are improving. Somewhere in the archives lie boxes of evidence that will one day speak.